Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this CNAS book talk. I'm Richard Fontaine, the CEO of the Center for New American Security. We're here today with Chris Kolenda. This is the book we'll be discussing. It's ZeroSum Victory, What We're Getting Wrong About War. Chris is an adjunct senior fellow at CNAS and the founder of the Strategic Leaders Academy. He's a West Point grad, an internationally renowned combat leader, a retired Army colonel, really a quintessential scholar warrior. Chris served in Afghanistan. While he was there, he defied the conventional wisdom and developed a strategy that motivated a large insurgent group to switch sides. That's the only example of that kind of success in the 20-year history of that war. He both fought the Taliban and negotiated with them. He worked for the Department of Defense. He's been in the private sector, has a PhD in war studies from King's College, London, and has both studied the issues we'll be talking about today and been right in the middle of the arena. And so we're really happy to have you here with us today, Chris. So welcome. And
thank you so much for having me, Richard. I appreciate that.
It's great to have you. Just a note to those who are watching virtually, if you have questions, if you want to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. But I know I have a lot, and I want to start with the real basics. So the book is Zero-Sum Victory. What exactly is a zero-sum victory, and what's wrong with that?
Well, zero-sum victory means that you essentially win everything, and your adversary loses everything. So it's like college football or baseball, where even if you have to go into extra innings or into overtime, you're going to keep going until there's a clear winner and there's a clear loser. There's nothing wrong with it per se. We ended like World War II that way, in many ways, a Civil War that way, although there were negotiations involved in both. The challenge is making sure that outcome, that desired outcome, is actually realistic. And one of the things I mentioned in Zero-Sum Victory is that in these wars against insurgencies, you look at Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, none of them hinged on battlefield outcomes. They all hinged on political legitimacy. And in a situation like that, zero-sum decisive victory just simply isn't realistic.
We'll get into what has gone wrong and ways to fix it. But if you look at the kind of defeats or problems, or however you'd like to define it, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and other places, and particularly when you're talking about irregular war, the kind of war that you're discussing at length in this book, one easy solution that one often hears these days is, well, let's just not do that anymore. Let's just stay out. I mean, why did we get involved in these things in the first place? Those were mistakes. Shouldn't have done it. And we've learned our lesson. We won't do it in the future. At a minimum, we have some sort of ISIS problem. We'll get others to do the fighting, at least on the ground. And at a maximum, we just won't bother with it. I mean, we got bigger fish to fry in China or whatever else. So why do we need a better approach to something that many people think we shouldn't be doing in the first place?
Well, we've been here before. And right. After Vietnam, we tried, we said the exact same thing. And as you know, we can't always choose our wars. And depending on what happens, we get attacked, for instance, the president's going to feel compelled to respond. We may have one of our allies that is involved in a conflict, and we're going to feel compelled to respond. So we can't always choose our conflicts, but we can choose how we prosecute them. And if I could just go to the whiteboard, just for a quick example, when you talk about the irregular war, Rand and others did longitudinal studies that looked at the probability of or look at wartime outcomes against insurgencies. And what they said were, when you sort through all the data, there are like two variables that are absolutely vital. One is government legitimacy. So is the government seen as legitimate in the eyes of the people? And one way to test that is, can they retake and retain territory from the insurgency? Or are they losing ground? So a government that was not seen as legitimate in the eyes of its people, or sufficiently legitimate in the eyes of its people, has been unsuccessful every single time against an insurgency. By contrast, if an insurgency is sustainable, it has been successful in every single conflict since at least the Second World War. Now, it doesn't mean that they overthrew the government. In some cases, in some situations, that's the case. But they could have gotten a better side of the negotiations. So if government legitimacy, government not legitimate, insurgency sustainable, or insurgency marginalized. So marginalized means they don't have internal and external support. The only way that in this kind of situation that you have a shot at getting a zero-sum decisive victory is if you have a government that's seen as legitimate and an insurgency that is cut off from both internal and external support. So in this case, zero-sum victory is possible. What we've seen in Iraq and Vietnam and Afghanistan is the doomsday scenario where this insurgency has been sustainable, the government is seen as not legitimate, and we wind up either getting stuck or we leave and the whole thing collapses. So in any situation other than the best case scenario, you are probably better off looking for a negotiated outcome early rather than trying to get it too late and losing all your leverage.
And if you sort of transpose that into the wars that you just mentioned, in Iraq, for example, what would that have looked like? Would we have been negotiating with AQI or some other element in Afghanistan? Yeah. What would that alternative to vanquishing the enemy and then coming home after turning the keys over to some other friendly entity in these cases? What would it actually look like?
Well, I think early on, what it would have looked like in Iraq is spending much more time working together with the Sunni Arab population instead of marginalizing them. So the government looked like it was constantly marginalizing the Sunni Arabs, and they revolted, and of course they became allied with AQI. AQI probably not certainly not an entity that you're going to negotiate with, but as we saw in 2007 and 2008, the Sunni Arab sheikhs and leaders, certainly people that you could negotiate with and work with. What we saw with the Taliban in Afghanistan, I mean, December of 2001, the Taliban offered to surrender. Karzai's people had negotiated, and I know some of the people involved in this on both sides had negotiated with the Taliban where the Taliban would give away the 4 provinces that they controlled at that point, and in return they would stop fighting and be allowed to live in peace. And Karzai was all for it. And you can look at I write about this in Zero-Sum Victory. There's a press conference on December 7th of 2001 where it's Secretary Rumsfeld and interim President Karzai, and Rumsfeld is asked about this agreement. He said, not only no, but heck no. These are bad people and need to be hunted down and captured or killed. And then there were other Taliban overtures in 2002 and 3 where they reportedly said the same things, and this time us and the Afghan government said no. In the negotiations I was involved with in 2011 to 2013, again, it was the Taliban that made the first move. They made the first overture. So because we get this sort of fixation on zero-sum victory, we tend to let these negotiating opportunities pass us by, thinking that, well, we're going to be even stronger in the future. And that's not necessarily the case, as we found out.
How does what you're arguing for is, if I can characterize this as maybe a middle pragmatic course as opposed to the maximalist approach, or saying we're just not going to be in the business of getting into these wars in the future, both of which I think you think is unrealistic. But does it seem vaguely un-American in a way to say that, we're going to go into a war and we're not going to win decisively? I mean, that's a pretty dramatic shift in terms of politics and sort of cognitive thinking about the way we engage in these things.
Right.
But I mean, how do you see that within the sweep of tradition that we've had?
Well, there's certainly the hangover from World War II, which says that all wars must end in a surrender ceremony on a U.S. battleship. And I mean, it would be great if that could happen. I am not arguing against the desirability. It's the feasibility. So in the case where the conflict turns on government legitimacy, you're not going to get a zero-sum decisive victory on the battlefield. And so you've got to look at other alternatives. So some of your alternatives are, you can get a zero-sum decisive victory. Negotiated outcome is how most wars end. Even decisive victories like in World War II in both theaters involve negotiations. The end of the Civil War involved negotiations. And then theoretically, in a war against an insurgency, you can transition to the host nation government. I don't know that proposition has ever been successful, but we know these first two have. And so understanding like what outcome you're looking for is going to govern your strategy. So one of the recommendations I make in Zero-Sum Victory is that as a part of the policymaking process, we ought to say, are we going for a zero-sum decisive victory? That's going to create a very military heavy strategy. Are we going to look for a negotiated outcome? In that case, you're probably going to prioritize the diplomatic line of effort. Or is it about transition? And if it's about transition, if that's our war termination method, then government legitimacy, the readiness of the host nation armed forces are the key variables there, and allowing a kleptocracy to develop and is going to damage both of those, and we've seen in all three of those big conflicts that I mentioned. The second response to your question is, I mean, how we do strategy. So we come in with this presupposition that we are going to have a zero-sum decisive victory. That's the American way of war. That's the American way of success. And so you've kind of got your start point, start of the war, and then you've got a pretty good idea of what success looks like. We had a pretty good idea in Afghanistan and Iraq what success might look like, what we desired. We have a pretty good idea of what failure looks like. And of course, when a war starts, between start and endpoint is what Clausewitz called the fog of war. And so what we do strategy-wise is we say, okay, fog of war, we can't see everything. So what we need to do is start at the end and reverse engineer towards the beginning. Excuse me. So we reverse engineer. We create our plan heading back to the start, and then to make sure we're on track, we put milestones up. So milestone could be elections. It could be building a host nation security force, et cetera. And then we go. And as we move forward, we hit the matrix that I mentioned earlier of government legitimacy and insurgency, and then you also have other external factors like international support, regional actors. So Pakistan played a huge role in the outcome in Afghanistan, for instance, and those interactions. Choices about for the government. Are they going to focus on good governance or kleptocracy? What are the incentives of the various international actors? And all those are going to shape the war. And what happens if we are in the lower left of that matrix, where we've got government legitimacy is low and insurgent sustainability is high, then what's happening in the conflict is we start drifting towards failure. The perception is that we're up here. because we're hitting milestones. We had a interim presidential election. We had a constitutional loya jirga. We had a presidential election. We've created armed forces. We've got an economic plan. We've got civil service, et cetera. So we're hitting the milestones. We believe that we're up on the success line when really we're drifting towards disaster. And then we get stuck in these strategies because of things like confirmation bias, thinking we're up here when we're really circling the drain, so to speak. Frictions, so bureaucratic frictions, DODs from Mars and states from Venus, and we don't talk the same language, and then entrapment by the host nation, who want to keep us there. And so there's an incentive for them to be unstable. So they keep us there, keep the money moving, and we're paying penalties and public support along the way. And then finally, at some point, a president says, enough is enough. We are going to leave. And since we're going to leave, let's see if we can negotiate our way out of this. Well, by then, your journey up to the success line is way too high. The insurgency has no reason to negotiate an end to the conflict because their incentives, they're better off after we've left than while we're there. And for the host nation, they just want to keep us there. So we either get stuck or we leave and things collapse. So the problem with zero-sum decisive victory when it's not, when the conditions aren't right, when the variables are not right, is we have this problem.
So this brings up something you touched on a few minutes ago, but I just want to come back to it, which is how do you measure where you are on those scales, right? So I can remember being in government and sitting through briefing after briefing after briefing that said electricity production in Iraq used to be X, but now it's X plus Y. The number of Iraqi security forces has increased by whatever. In Afghanistan, the number of schools that have been built, there are all these different metrics,
right,
that we're supposed to show at a macro level that we're being successful in the endeavor, and that more modestly are trying to demonstrate the legitimacy of the government. And then sometimes when the pushback was, yeah, but violence is sort of off the charts. Say, well, of course it's off the charts because the government's fighting so hard, right? I mean, that's what we want.
We're winning,
right? I mean, and so you get to this position where, well, how do you know? How do you know if the government is legitimate? How do you know if the government's not legitimate? How do you know if you're moving in the right direction and therefore what is possible?
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite examples of that was enemy initiated attacks, where if it was an enemy initiated attack, it meant the enemy had like the initiative, and that was bad. If it was an offensive engagement, it mean we had the initiative, and that was good. Right. And I remember sitting at the ISAF headquarters one year, and you're just watching the morning update, and there's this discussion about, well, was that really an enemy initiated attack, or was it actually an offensive engagement? Right. And so, of course, there's all these perverse incentives to call things offensive engagements. And so you get some really strange things with those kind of metrics. I mean, I go back to, and again, on these conflicts with insurgencies, I mean, what are the critical variables? And so you can do, well, I'll just keep it on this one. So you can do a simple double axis chart, and you know that, let's see, government will. So let's say, I'm most familiar with Afghanistan, so then I got it on my brain. So Afghan government will on one side, Taliban will on the other, and then international support for the Afghan government. And then finally on the bottom would be Taliban external support. So sanctuary in Pakistan, other things. And then you could do a scale of 0 to 10. So if these are the crucial the real strategic variables, like I'm not talking about electricity or number of schools built. I mean, these are things that are going to govern the success or failure of the conflict. And when you look at, let's say 2001, for instance, you probably had a situation that looked about like this with high Afghan government will, high international support, low support for the Taliban, low Taliban will. Probably look like that. By the time you get to 2021, you have low Afghan government will, low international support, high external support for the Taliban, high levels of Taliban will, boom. So you have to ask, I think, when you can do a construct like this for just about any conflict. What are the requirements for zero-sum decisive victory? Are those requirements realistic? And if they're not realistic, then you've got to look for a different outcome.
You mentioned Clausewitz a few minutes ago. One of the other Clausewitzian maxims that you quote in your book is don't take your first step before you've considered your last, which of course is the tell me how this ends question with these kinds of conflicts. In Vietnam, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, ultimately the military objective, it seems to me, was the United States changed it in the course of, went in hoping or expecting or planning to win decisively. But in Afghanistan, for example, moved from we're going to defeat the Taliban to we're going to prevent the government from falling to the Taliban, which is a different objective. But it took years and years and years for us to adopt a more modest objective short of decisive victory. And then even then found it very difficult to obtain even that more modest objective. So let's say, for whatever reason, the United States enters into one of these conflicts feeling decisive, right? We're going to do this. And then it becomes clear, or should become clear, that that's not an attainable objective. What's the difficulty that the United States has had in altering its military objectives and therefore trying to get something out of these enterprises that would be achievable and sustainable?
Right. So these three things have been consistently the problems that are getting us stuck in these losing or ineffective strategies. So cognitive bias, confirmation bias. So we perceive we're up here when we're really down there. Sunk cost, status quo bias. All of these things are sort of working against being able to change a strategy. We've got the political and bureaucratic frictions. Presidents have elections. They've got constituencies that are important to those elections. They've got to pay attention to them. You have got state, DOD, the IC, others that have their incentives and often talk past one another. One of the reforms I mentioned is that we need a basic national security dictionary where the same words mean the same thing to everybody in the room. I remember back in 2009, there was this massive argument, big furball about the word defeat. And for the military, defeat means enemy cannot pursue their chosen course of action. But in state and in the White House, that was taken to mean eradication of the Taliban. And it was taken to mean that, DOD is trying to box in the president to this massive troop surge. And it really poisoned civil military relations because we're using the same terms to mean different things.
Chris, can I just ask you about that? Yeah. Because I think it's a super important point. From the outside, I got to see this a little bit in the Iraq debate, which was when President Bush said we're winning in Iraq, and I went off of my former boss John McCain to Iraq for the 10th time or something like that, and military commanders on the ground at one point said, yes, we're winning in Iraq. And we said, well, it's like 4th of July with real fireworks out there. There's no political or economic activity. The only people on the streets are fighting. Is this really what winning looks like? And they said, well, of course, because winning is a transition of security responsibility from Americans to Iraqis. And so the only thing we really have to look at is the training of the Iraqi security forces. And because there's more every week, we're winning. And of course, that was not how the president, I think, would have, or the policymakers would have defined it, nor is it how the American people would have probably defined it if they were sort of forced to come up with a definition of that. So where does that definition, who gives those definitions? What's the right way to do this?
Well, first of all, I think we ought to within about less than a month, you could create a national security dictionary of key terms and concepts that everybody makes. I bet CNAS could even lead that effort and put that together. And it would save lives, because you've got people saying the same things and meaning the same things. Another thing that makes this problematic is we have nobody functionally in charge of our wars. So the way we do it is, of course, you've got the president as the commander in chief. There we go. And supporting the president is like the National Security Council and various entities like the chairman, the IC, and stuff like that. And then we deploy in bureaucratic silos into theater. So let's say this is Afghanistan, Iraq, or whatever. You've got a DoD silo, so you've got your 4-star general. You may have special operations forces that work for somebody else. At one point in Afghanistan, the Marines worked for CENTCOM. They wouldn't work for ISAF. So we'll just put them down. You've got the embassy with the ambassador. USAID, the aid director, technically works for state. They kind of operate on their own. And then you've got the IC, and they've got their different flavors. So who's in charge? There's nobody in charge. And so nobody is making these decisions about what defeat looks like. Nobody is making these decisions about trade-offs between different efforts. And then there's nobody the president can hold accountable. So when Congress asks somebody to testify, the 4-star general will go up and they'll say, 4-star general, how are things going? We're making great progress. I mean, exactly what you said. We killed or captured X number of Taliban, and we've developed this many security forces. We're making great progress. This is what winning looks like. And then they bring the ambassador in front of Congress. Ambassador, well, how are we doing? Well, we're making great progress. We've trained this many civil servants. We've got this many different initiatives going on with focused district development and some of these other initiatives. This is what winning looks like. Aid director, what is that? Give me a report. Well, we've built this many schools, we've paved this many roads, et cetera, and we're making great progress. And then you do the same thing with the IC, and like when everybody is reporting great progress, but things are circling the drain, you've got a silo problem. So this is a major problem, a major impediment to success. And then, the other part of your question strategically, and again, I'll go back to Afghanistan just because it's such a clear reference. In 2011, we had 5 lines of effort, and we said all 5 have to be successful. So those 5 were like degrade Taliban, transition to Afghan security forces, strategic partnership in the form of a bilateral security agreement, regional diplomacy to get people to stop supporting the Taliban and support a stable Afghanistan, and finally reconciliation. And we had to go 5 for 5. So when you look at the probabilities, I'll be generous. So degrading the Taliban to where they couldn't pose a threat to the Afghan government. Oops, got a little, there we go. Maybe let's say 70%. Transition to Afghan security forces. So they took control of security, maybe 80%. So that's pretty good. Bilateral security agreement, we probably thought it was around 70 or so % likelihood, although Karzai then refused to sign it, and it took a few more years. Regional diplomacy was much less, maybe 30% chance that was going to be successful, and reconciliation like a 0.1. And the temptation would be to add this up and divide by 5. And if you add it up and divide it by 5, you'd say 26, 26, and so that's better than 26 out of 50. That's better than 50-50. But because these are interconnected, and you have to go 5 for 5, you have to multiply them. And so I don't know if anybody out there has got a calculator, but when you multiply all of that, you get a 1.176 probability of success. And so I think the broadly framing these sort of issues, broadly framing the kind of 0 to 10s and the key variables about Afghan government legitimacy, insurgency, sustainability, et cetera, are ways that we can reduce the likelihood that we just simply get stuck in breathing our own exhaust.
Let me ask you, I want to get to your own experience in Afghanistan and how some of this applies in just a second, but and I should remind folks who are watching, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. We'll try to get to it. But on the structure question that you just got at with the silos and things like that, there's been two possible solutions of this that at least I can think of that have been tried over the years. One was there was for a time a deputy national security advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan whose job nominally was to oversee the wars. And then, of course, there was a coalition provisional authority headed by the administrator of the coalition provisional authority in Iraq for a year, who had vast authority, not including military command authority and not including intelligence authority. Right.
So had
but maybe influence over some of those decisions. Are either of those closer to the mark in terms of what you envision relative to what we have today, or how do you sort of see those two experiments?
So the Bremer problem was that he only had authority over this,
right,
and not over these two.
Right,
and those two were the biggest elephants in the room. The Deputy National Security Advisor, it maybe is a coordinating body, but again, is not on the ground and not making decisions. And so you'd have to go to something that looks like this. Again, you got the president advised by the National Security Council, but working directly for the president, perhaps confirmed by the Senate, or a Senate confirmed, person who's already been confirmed, would be what General McChrystal called a high commissioner. So super envoy, high commissioner, a variety of different terms. And then everybody on the ground in theater, to include this person, would work for that, I'll just say, high commissioner. So the 4-star general, the ambassador, and maybe the high commissioner and the ambassador are the same person, aid, IC, et cetera. So every deployed element would report to this person, and this person would be responsible for achieving U.S. national aims and accountable to the president for doing so. So you get clear accountability. And the other way, the president can't hold really anybody accountable for achieving our aims, because all the silos, the lowest person in the government, all the silos connect to is the president. You can't run a business that way or a war that way. So when you have this, something like this, then the president can hold that person accountable. Congress can bring that person to in front of Congress, so that you now have proper checks and balances, and Congress can hold the administration accountable. I think the president could essentially do this, could put somebody overall in charge. There may have to be some sort of funding mechanism that that supports them. But I think this is your answer, or something that's closer to the mark, that at least is going to create some accountability and avoid the silo problem.
I want to ask you, I keep saying I'm going to ask you about Afghanistan and your own experience, but with just one more question on this, because it's just something I want to foot stomp. We talked about it at the very beginning, but I could see people who are reading the book or listening to this and saying, okay, here we go again. We're talking about a super empowered high commissioner that's going to run affairs in some country about which we know little. This feels very 2010s counterinsurgency, all this other stuff. Today is about high tech, great power competition, high end potential, God forbid, conventional war among the great powers. The stuff that you're sort of sketching out, which is a better way to do the things we would prefer not to do, but
right.
very likely we'll have to do in the future, isn't material to the big questions of the day. I think it is, but just, again, maybe just a foot stomp. Why think about all these things now when we got China to think about? We have war in Russia and Ukraine.
Right. Well, and administration's only got so much bandwidth. So this group of people right now have their hands directly on. I mean, they're talking about the details of policies and all of these faraway conflicts and all of these different challenges. And so you just multiply this by, at the time, you've got some of these other smaller conflicts, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, and then you've got, Ukraine. You've got efforts in the Koreas, et cetera. And I mean, there's only so many hours in the day for this group. And so, I mean, there were times in Afghanistan where you couldn't get an NSC meeting for like months. And so in the meantime, all of these different efforts are running in their own silos. So it doesn't matter whether it's high tech or low tech. Bottom line is the president needs somebody that they can hold accountable. I mean, that's why we have ambassadors in countries. And so when we have these significant military efforts, and you've got multiple agencies on the ground, you've got to have somebody that the president can hold accountable.
So could you talk a little bit about your own personal experience in Afghanistan and maybe connect it to some of the things you're talking about? So what did you understand at the time? You're a colonel in the hinterlands of Afghanistan, given a particular mission. What did you understand as the strategic objective of the war in Afghanistan in which you were a part? What did you understand your own objective to be? And then what did you understand as the acceptable means by which you might be able to attain that objective?
Well, some of those questions were several echelons above my pay grade.
No, so, totally.
Yeah. But I mean, look, we were there. We would have loved to have caught bin Laden. This is 2007 and 8 when I was a battalion commander out there. So it was part the counterterrorism mission. We didn't really have Al Qaeda in our area. And so we had a couple of different insurgent groups. We had the Taliban and the Hizb Islami, and who are currently kind of joined at the hip and fighting us. And our thought was, well, going into it, we thought, well, shoot, all the enemies coming from Pakistan, and so we need to focus on like border interdiction and clobbering people who come across the border and keeping them away from the public. And within the first 90 days, I mean, we're just in these firefights that get bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, we win every firefight, but they just keep getting bigger. And it's like, okay, something's not adding up here. And then we had a biggest firefight. 2 of our guys were killed, several wounded. And I just remember sitting on the mountaintop during that, after that fight, just saying, there's something we're not seeing here. There's something we're missing. And so we kind of circled the wagons and said, all right, let's erase the whiteboard and let's figure out, let's look at what we see. Let's write down what we see, and rather than what we've been told, let's go by what we see and then figure out what that tells us. And what it told us essentially was that the enemy was, not this sort of invading force from Pakistan, that there were 95% of them locals. So 95% of the people we thought we were trying to help were actually trying to kill us. Not so comforting thought. And the second thing was that most are fighting for a fairly practical reason. So if we could build relationships and understand those practical reasons why people are fighting, and then work together with them to reduce those reasons, and at the same time give them something positive to look forward to in terms of the relationship with us, then maybe we can reverse this cycle. And we took a lot of advice from Afghan elders and others, and that's essentially what we came to is we got to focus on governance. So building relationships, working with local village councils, et cetera, doing confidence building measures with them. And SERP was a great way to do confidence building measures. And over time, what happened is the elders who had maybe gotten marginalized by the militants, eventually they started, things went like that. And they were able to get a lot more control and authority over their people. And they looked at I asked one of the head elders, like, hey, how do you plan to do this? Are you just going to tell them to stop fighting? He's like, no, that's not how it works here. We're going to get the young men on our side, and then the big leaders will come with us. And that's exactly what happened. And that's why the Hizb Islami stopped fighting and switched sides, moved the Taliban out of that area for a while. And then later on the Taliban came back.
So when I asked you about the objectives and what was acceptable ways to achieve them, what I was getting at was this, was what you just described, local improvisation by a particularly creative and, wide-minded colonel on the ground there and his comrades
with a lot of help.
or was this on the menu of means by which you could obtain the objective? The objective is to defeat the insurgent. You can defeat the insurgent by killing or capturing. You get defeat the insurgent by getting them to switch sides, right? And so if one of those is easier than the other, then presumably you would want to explore it, right? Which is, in fact, exactly what you did. But, unless I'm wrong, that's the only time in the 20-year history of Afghanistan that was done.
Yeah, it was a good thing we were way out in the hinterlands. But for a while it was radioactive. I was accused of negotiating with terrorists and, all of these other, sort of things. I'm like, hey, it's just the nature of our area, and eventually when people started to see it working, then it's like, oh, okay, well, this is actually, what are you guys doing over there? And then General McChrystal asked me to help him with his counterinsurgency doctrine. And so he was trying to do a lot of the similar things. And I think the point is that, we tend to train military officers in, doctrine and military tactics and things like that. And all that's really important. No amount of military tactics was going to improve the situation. And we had to do something very different, and just taking what we saw in front of us and doing a bit of analysis kind of led us to that conclusion.
It's an amazing accomplishment. Maybe we could talk a little bit about how you might transpose some of the principles and lessons that you articulate in the book to some of the things going on today. So Israel in Gaza today is engaged in essentially a regime change operation. The stated military objective is the destruction of Hamas, at least as a military entity, if not as a military and as a governing entity. If you were looking at the situation now through the prism of some of the things that you've articulated here, would the approach look the same as what the Israelis are doing, different things in addition, dwelling more on what the end game should be while you're, in the middle of the act of fighting, or how do you see that?
Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, I couldn't imagine being in Israel right now and post October 7th attack. When we look at us post September 11th, anybody who was saying talk to the Taliban, you were soft on terrorism or whatever. We're much quicker to encourage other people to go for negotiated outcomes than we are to accept them ourselves. And so, when I think about that question, of course, I'm no expert on Israel and Palestine. Looking from the book's perspective and looking at it, maybe framing some things broadly, strategically, you can do a double axis chart. And it seems like the four key variables here are Israeli will, Hamas's will, international, primarily U.S. support for Israel, and external support for Hamas. And so in order for Israel to win a decisive victory, eradicating Hamas, et cetera, and you did a 0 to 10. So, I mean, what would you say would be, so in order for Israel to achieve that zero-sum victory, what would, on a scale of 0 to 10, what would Israel's will have to look like? We'll just kind of.
Well, I think the will now is about as high as it's ever going to be. So
right.
Very, very high.
And on the U.S. support side, Israel is getting all the support they need right now from us. So I'd argue that's about a 10. And then, I mean, in terms of like Hamas's will and external support from Hamas.
External support, no, not now.
Right.
Hamas's will is the hard part, I would say, to assess from this far out. But
yeah, for there to be a decisive victory, it would probably have to look something like Hamas loses its will to fight. The external supporters of Hamas lose their will to sustain it. And so zero-sum decisive victory probably looks something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've got right now probably looks something about like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, can you create a situation in which Hamas, this would be your decisive victory scenario. Is it realistic to get there?
Yeah. And then of course you have what comes next. And this is an obviously critical question, but it does strike me that if you stopped American policymakers at the equivalent amount of time after September 11th, say middle of October 2001, and said, after the Taliban is gone, who's going to run Afghanistan? They would not have said, well, there's this guy Hamid Karzai, and there's this guy Abdul Haq who is probably going to get killed, and then we'll have a bond process, and then we'll have a constitution. I mean, it was, in that sense, it's very different than Iraq, for example, right, where we had plenty of time to prepare and didn't do so adequately. But both in 9/11 for us and October 7th for the Israelis, you have to start and then sort of figure it out as you're going along, which must make this more difficult than if you have the luxury of time to think it through in advance.
Absolutely. You cannot set aside or wish away the emotion.
Yeah.
This on all sides. And so in my book, I'm on the one hand critical that the United States didn't even entertain this early peace deal with the Taliban in 2001. At the same time, it's understandable because of the emotions. Mm-hmm. And so that's a hugely important variable in all of this. And it leads to some of the, cognitive biases. On one hand, it can also strengthen a country's or an organization's will to continue the fight on the other. So, in this kind of situation, emotions are high on all sides. And at the same time, being able to frame something broadly, and this is not, of course, not the only framing, but at least helping us think through and visually depict, giving us a process visual. So we have a conscious process for thinking through the likelihoods of different outcomes, and then figuring out exactly what does a realistic and sustainable success look like.
There's a question that's coming from Sedge. It says, it seems to me that this message is valuable not just to war planners and leadership, but equally necessary to conditioning the public and adopting new ways of seeing military outcomes that they can accept. How can this framework be shared to shift, quote, the American way?
Well, thanks, Sedge. I appreciate your question. And again, I think it's, especially in these smaller conflicts, I mean, one of the challenges to sustain public support in a democracy for a smaller conflict, you play on emotion. And you paint the other side, the adversary is evil. the Taliban in the Afghanistan example as Al-Qaeda bedfellows, and it took about 10 years to disentangle that. You can't wish that away because it's going to happen. I think that especially when we are in White House Situation Room meetings, broadly framing some of these issues can be really important and can help political leaders potentially talk about why things like talks and might be necessary, and zero-sum victory just not realistic. So they would do that. They would articulate that much better than me. But for my part, I think helping people, giving people a way to visualize what's going on and what happens next is can be very helpful.
Gibbs has a question. It's something that you stress in the book about the proper military role in these conflicts, and that we've relied on the military to do things well outside their sort of mandate, and with poor effects. How do you cabin the military's role appropriately in this, and does that require, in turn, somehow empowering the non-military elements of the U.S. government to better be able to be engaged?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I think it goes back to this issue of having somebody, whether it's an ambassador, high commissioner, or maybe in like Gulf War I, it's a military figure who is in charge on the ground, and everybody, all deployed elements of U.S. power, then work for that person. You're going to be able to reduce some of these challenges of a super empowered military. So the president is going to speak directly with this person, and this is the accountability line. So you're not going to get an overly militarized policy here, or you're at least going to reduce the risk of that when you put somebody with authority on the ground. In some of our smaller places where we're doing like foreign internal defense, everybody works for the ambassador. That's the model here, and we've got to apply it to these larger conflicts, and it'll reduce some of that overly militarized or over reliance on military force to achieve national outcomes. The second thing is one of the ways that we make policy is, there's a conflict or a conflict brewing. The president looks to the military and says, "Give me options." At that point, we've already poisoned the well, so to speak. So what should happen is the president ought to turn to the National Security Advisor and say, "Give me options." And then you would have some interagency teams creating some options. So you might have one team that creating a zero-sum victory option. This is we're going for decisive military victory. Boom. Here's what that option looks like. Here are the pluses and minuses of it. Another team maybe is going for some form of negotiated outcome. Here's what a negotiated outcome that meets our interests would look like, and for a sustainable success. And then maybe a third team working on a different outcome. But that way, it's an interagency effort that is prioritizing one or other element of national power, and it's given the president real options instead of what the president often gets, which is high levels of military force, medium levels of military force, or low levels of military force, and then everybody else sort of cheering on whichever the president selects.
Before we break, I'd like to ask you maybe to just reflect on something that I know you have thought a lot about and been very involved in, which is the human side of everything we're talking about. These conversations and this wonderful book that you've written can sometimes be abstract. And of course, it's our fighting men and women who are on the ground, that are risking their lives and serving the country, that are, right in the middle of decisions made in places far away from them. You did a more than 1,000-mile bike ride to visit the graves of, I believe, 6 of your soldiers who were lost in Afghanistan, killed in action. Why did you do that? And how did you see the human side of the things that you're talking about, which is, in addition to the big think stuff, something that no one knows better than you from your experience?
We were on the 15th anniversary of that deployment, and as you mentioned, we lost 6 of our troopers in that during that deployment. And as we're coming up on 15 years, I wanted to do something, I guess, significant to mark their service and sacrifice, and so they're not just names etched in granite somewhere, and tell their stories at least as I saw them, and get other people to tell their versions of their stories, and so I thought, well, I could drive the 1,700 miles to visit the graves. They're essentially from Spalding, Nebraska, to eastern Pennsylvania, and then down to Arlington. I could drive 1,700 miles. I thought, that just isn't quite substantial enough. I figured I could walk 1,700 miles, but it would just take way too long. So I thought, well, I could ride a bike. I bet I could ride a bike 1,700 miles. The only problems were I didn't own a bike, and I hadn't ridden a bike in 20 years. So I, bought a fancy road bike to give myself incentive to ride it. I hired a cycling coach to get me in shape, and then started telling people so I don't chicken out. And so the ride started on September 25th of 2007, which is 15 years to the day when Chris Pfeiffer died of wounds. And so we started at his grave in Spalding, Nebraska. His parents, Mike and Dar, were there, and his widow, Karen, and their daughter, Peyton, who was born 2 days after Chris died of wounds. So we started there, and we went and visited each site, saw families at each one. Some of the families, I'd kept in contact with, and some I hadn't spoken with since the day their loved one died. And just being there with them it was just such an absolute joy. We were able to raise money for a nonprofit to help the members of our unit and their families, as well as other veterans. And by the time I finished, I felt great physically. My coach was awesome. We trained like 10,000 miles for this. Emotionally, I was exhausted, and just very thankful for all the people that encouraged me along the way to do this, who supported me. Nobody does anything like that alone. And so it was something I was very glad what we did. And now we're able to do a lot of good with that, with the Saber 6 Foundation, in helping people create new purpose, belonging, and well-being in their lives, so that they look at life through the windshield and not through the rearview mirror. And I think that's how we reduce veteran suicide and veteran depression.
And CNN and other media outlets ended up covering this, and what you did is really amazing and really remarkable. Thank you for that. Thank you for being with us today. So the book, once again, here it is, ZeroSum Victory, What We're Getting Wrong About War. Colonel Christopher Kolenda, thank you for joining us. Thanks for talking with us.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
Thank you for everyone who joined us for this book talk.